You can't solve this problem." The whole class laughed before she even stood up. The sound of it stayed in the air like dust floating in a beam of morning light, thin and cruel and impossible to ignore. Emily Carter sat in the third row by the window of Jefferson High in Columbus, Ohio. Her notebook edges curled from being carried back and forth in a backpack that had seen better years. Outside, yellow school buses idled along the curb engines, humming low. But inside room 214, the air felt tight, charged with the kind of anticipation that usually meant someone was about to be embarrassed. Emily kept her eyes on the chalkboard, where Mr. Jonathan Reed had written the problem in precise white lines, a mathematical riddle first proposed more than 200 years ago. One that had humiliated scholars and inspired debates in universities she had only read about in library books. She wore the same gray sweater she had owned since sophomore year, sleeves stretched at the wrists, and she could feel the weight of every sideways glance from classmates who measured worth in new sneakers and summer vacations on the coast. No one knew that after school, she spent hours in the public library, 3 miles from her apartment, flipping through second-hand calculus textbooks donated by strangers, copying proofs by hand because she couldn't afford her own copies. Mr. Reed leaned against his desk, confident, charismatic, certain of the outcome before it even began. To him, this was a lesson in humility. To the class, it was entertainment. But to Emily, staring at the numbers, tracing the structure in her mind, it was something else entirely. It was familiar. It was solvable. And for the first time since freshman year, she slowly began to raise her hand. Her hand did not shoot up with confidence. It rose slowly, almost cautiously, as if even she was testing whether she truly believed what her mind was whispering. A few students turned in their seats. Tyler Henderson smirked openly, leaning back in his chair with the easy arrogance of someone who had never worried about the electric bill being paid on time. Mr. Jonathan Reed noticed the movement and lifted one eyebrow, surprised but faintly amused. Emily Carter rarely spoke in class unless called on. She kept her answers short, precise, careful not to draw attention. The room grew quieter, but not respectful. It was the kind of quiet that waits for something to go wrong. Mr. Reed folded his arms across his chest and nodded toward the board. He did not discourage her, but he did not hide the skepticism in his eyes. The chalk rested in the tray beneath the equations, a simple white stick that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Emily stood from her chair, the metal legs scraping softly against the tile floor, and walked the 12 steps to the front of the room. Each step felt measured, deliberate. She could feel 30 pairs of eyes tracking her like a slow-moving spotlight. Up close, the problem looked different than it had from her desk. She could see the structure more clearly, the hidden symmetry tucked inside the complex notation. Her fingers hovered just above the chalk. In her mind, she was not in room 214 anymore. She was at the wooden table in the Columbus Public Library, late evening light fading through tall windows, a stack of worn mathematics journals spread in front of her. She took a slow breath, reached down and picked up the chalk. The chalk touched the board with a soft, deliberate scrape, and the first line she wrote was not flashy or dramatic. It was simple, foundational. She did not try to attack the problem where it looked strongest. She rewrote it in a different form, shifting the variables, isolating the structure, the way she had practiced night after night at her kitchen table, while her mother worked the late shift at the grocery store on Maple Avenue. A few students exchanged glances. This was not guessing. This was intentional. Tyler let out a quiet laugh under his breath, but it faded quickly when she continued without hesitation, transforming the original equation into something cleaner, something that revealed a hidden pattern beneath the surface. Mr. Reed straightened slightly from where he had been leaning against his desk. He had expected confusion by now, a stalled silence, maybe a nervous glance back at the class. Instead, Emily moved steadily, her handwriting small but precise, every symbol placed with care. The classroom clock ticked loudly above the whiteboard, each second stretching longer than usual. She paused only once, not because she was lost, but because she was choosing. There were two directions she could take, and one of them had trapped mathematicians for generations. She closed her eyes for half a heartbeat, remembering a footnote from an old journal article she had found in the public library, a line most readers would have skipped. When she opened them again, her hand moved decisively, drawing a connection no one else in the room seemed to recognize. The laughter had stopped completely now. Even Tyler was silent. And for the first time, Mr. Reed stepped closer to the board, no longer watching, as a spectator, but as someone beginning to question what he thought he already knew. Mr. Reed moved closer until he was standing just 3 feet from the board, close enough to see the faint tremor in the chalk dust as it settled beneath each line Emily wrote. He did not interrupt her, but the shift in his posture was unmistakable. His arms were no longer folded. His expression had changed from amusement to calculation. Emily continued layering step upon step, not rushing, not performing, simply building. She substituted a term that most mathematicians had historically treated as fixed, then redefined its constraint using an approach so subtle it almost looked like a mistake. A few students leaned forward in their seats. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, filling the silence that had replaced the earlier laughter. Outside the classroom windows, a gust of Ohio wind rattled the glass for a moment, but no one turned to look. Every eye was now on the board. Tyler shifted in his chair, the confidence draining from his posture as he tried to follow her reasoning and could not quite keep up. Mr. Reed cleared his throat once, not to challenge her, but to buy himself time to think. He recognized the classical pathway she had avoided, the familiar dead end that scholars had debated for 2 centuries. What unsettled him was the path she was carving instead. It was unconventional, almost reckless at first glance, yet internally consistent. Emily stepped slightly to the side to review what she had written so far. The whiteboard was nearly half covered, the original form of the problem barely visible beneath her reconstruction. She tightened her grip on the chalk and introduced a transformation that reframed the entire equation in geometric terms rather than purely algebraic ones. That was when Mr. Reed inhaled sharply. He had not considered that angle in years. The class did not understand the significance yet, but he did. And for the first time since she walked to the front of the room, uncertainty flickered across his face. Emily could feel the shift in the room even without turning around. The air no longer carried amusement. It carried tension. She heard the faint squeak of someone adjusting in a plastic chair, the soft tap of a pencil dropping onto a desk and not being picked back up. Mr. Reed stepped even closer now, standing at her side rather than behind her, his gaze scanning each symbol as if searching for the flaw he was certain had to be there. Emily did not rush to the final line. She understood that the danger was not in the beginning, but in the middle, where elegant ideas often collapsed under their own weight. She erased a small portion of her earlier expression, not because it was wrong, but because it could be made clearer. The chalk left a pale smear across the board, as she refined the logic, tightening the argument the way she had practiced so many nights at her kitchen counter, a single lamp casting warm light over pages of handwritten notes while the refrigerator hummed steadily in the background. She introduced a limiting condition that transformed the geometric framing into a solvable boundary case. Mr. Reed's jaw tightened slightly. He recognized that move. It was advanced. It was not something typically taught in high school classrooms. Tyler leaned forward. Now his earlier smirk completely gone, his eyes darting between the board and Mr. Reed's face looking for reassurance. There was none. Emily's handwriting remained steady, her breathing controlled. She connected the transformed boundary to the original structure in a way that closed a gap mathematicians had long treated as unsolvable. It was not flashy. It was precise. The board was almost completely filled now, layers of logic built carefully on top of one another. She paused for a brief moment, staring at the final space left in the lower right corner. One step remained. Mr. Reed did not speak. He did not blink. And in that silence, the outcome no longer felt predictable. The last open space on the board felt smaller than it should have, as if the entire classroom had narrowed into that single blank corner. Emily stared at it, not with fear, but with calculation. She could sense Mr. Reed beside her close enough that she could hear the controlled rhythm of his breathing. He was no longer waiting for her to fail. He was waiting to see whether she understood the weight of what she was about to claim. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote the final transformation, drawing the boundary condition inward and substituting it back into the original framework she had reconstructed from the ground up. The motion was steady, almost gentle, as though she were placing the final piece into a puzzle that had been scattered for generations. A faint line of chalk dust clung to her fingers, but her grip did not tremble. Behind her, the classroom was completely still. No whispers, no shifting chairs. Even the clock seemed quieter, as if time itself had paused to watch. She completed the substitution and simplified the expression step by step, refusing to skip even one logical bridge. That was the difference. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was proving it beyond argument. The final line emerged gradually, not with dramatic flair, but with clarity. A closed form. A conclusion that aligned perfectly with every constraint she had established. She stepped back half a pace, eyes scanning the board from top left to bottom right, testing it the way she had trained herself to do at the public library, retracing every assumption, every inference. Nothing collapsed. Nothing contradicted. Mr. Reed leaned forward, his face inches from the equations, reading carefully. His hand lifted slightly, as if he might point out an oversight, but it stopped mid-air. The logic held. It was not reckless. It was rigorous. Emily lowered the chalk to the tray without turning around. The board was full. The silence in room 214 was no longer waiting for her to fail. It was waiting for him to speak. Mr. Reed did not speak immediately. He read from the top again, slower this time, tracing each transformation with his eyes, as if he were walking back through unfamiliar territory. The silence stretched across the classroom, thick and unsteady. Emily remained standing near the board, hands at her sides, resisting the urge to fill the quiet with explanation. She had already said everything she needed to say in chalk. A bead of sweat slid down Tyler Henderson's temple as he tried to follow the logic written in front of him, flipping through his notebook pages, as if the answer might appear there instead. It did not. Mr. Reed finally reached the final line again and narrowed his eyes. "Explain this substitution," he said, his voice controlled but sharper than before. He pointed to the geometric boundary she had introduced. It was not a dismissal. It was a challenge. Emily stepped forward again and spoke clearly, her tone steady. She explained how the boundary was not an assumption, but a derived constraint from the earlier transformation, how the structure of the equation forced that limitation, once the variables were reframed in geometric space rather than treated purely symbolically. She referenced the internal symmetry, the cancellation that occurred only under that condition. The class did not fully understand the technical depth, but they understood one thing: she was not guessing. Mr. Reed pressed further, questioning the stability of the limit as it approached the defined threshold. Emily answered without hesitation, guiding the reasoning step by step, never raising her voice, never rushing. Each answer reinforced the previous one. The tension in the room shifted from skepticism to unease. If she was correct, then what they were witnessing was not a lucky attempt. It was something far larger. Mr. Reed leaned back slightly, but he did not concede. "If your boundary holds," he said slowly, "then extend it." The words landed like a new test, layered on top of the old one. Emily looked at the board again. Extending it would either confirm everything or unravel it completely. She reached for the chalk once more. Emily felt the weight of the extension before she even wrote the first symbol. Extending the boundary was not a simple continuation. It was where most attempts historically fractured, where elegant reasoning lost its balance and collapsed into contradiction. She placed the chalk against the board again and carefully rewrote the limiting expression, expanding it beyond the initial threshold Mr. Reed had questioned. The classroom seemed smaller now, the walls pressing inward as every student watched her test the very foundation she had built. She adjusted the geometric framing, translating it into an analytic continuation that allowed the constraint to stretch without breaking internal symmetry. Tyler leaned forward so far that the legs of his chair scraped softly across the tile. Mr. Reed stood motionless, his eyes fixed on each movement of her hand. Emily did not look at him. She focused only on the structure. She substituted the extended form back into the original reconstruction and simplified slowly, deliberately, exposing each intermediate step so there could be no accusation of hidden shortcuts. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the whiteboard, illuminating the growing complexity of the proof. A few students exchanged uncertain glances, no longer sure what they were witnessing. Emily reached the critical juncture, the point where divergence had historically appeared. Her heart pounded once hard enough that she felt it in her throat, but her expression did not change. She introduced a corrective term derived from the internal symmetry she had identified earlier, balancing the expansion in a way that neutralized the instability. The algebra tightened instead of unraveling. The geometric interpretation remained intact. She continued reducing the expression until the extended boundary aligned seamlessly with the earlier result. No contradiction, no collapse. The logic held under pressure. She stepped back half a step, scanning the board again, testing the extension the same way she had tested the original. The silence in the room deepened. Mr. Reed's face had lost all trace of skepticism. What remained was something closer to recognition, and perhaps for the first time doubt about his own certainty. The extension did not fracture. It strengthened. Emily could feel it in the way the equations settled into place, like beams locking into the frame of a structure that refused to sway. She ran through the expanded logic once more in her mind, retracing each transformation from the original reframing to the analytic continuation she had just stabilized. Nothing drifted out of alignment. Nothing contradicted the foundation. Mr. Reed stepped forward again, this time close enough that his shoulder almost brushed the board. He examined the corrective term she had introduced, his eyes narrowing as he tested it against the classical objections that had defeated scholars for generations. He picked up a piece of chalk from the tray, hesitated, then marked a small notation beside her extension, probing for instability. Emily watched calmly as he manipulated the expression, attempting to expose divergence under a slightly altered condition. The class held its breath. Tyler gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale. The clock ticked once, twice. Mr. Reed simplified his alteration and stopped. The instability he expected did not appear. Instead, the symmetry absorbed it. He erased his own mark slowly, the chalk leaving a faint streak across the board before disappearing entirely. Emily understood what that meant. The challenge had been real. The defense had held. A murmur almost formed in the back of the room, but dissolved before it became sound. Mr. Reed straightened, studying the full board from left to right, as though seeing it not as a high school exercise but as a genuine mathematical argument. His confidence had not vanished, but it had shifted. It was no longer anchored in dismissal. It was anchored in evaluation. There is still the historical objection, he said, carefully referring to the 200-year dead end that had defined the problem's reputation. Emily nodded slightly. She had anticipated that. She stepped forward once more and drew a thin line beneath the final expression separating the construction from what would come next. If she addressed the historical objection directly, there would be no retreat. She began to reconstruct the classical contradiction that had blocked every previous attempt, writing it out clearly, so no one could accuse her of ignoring it. The classroom watched as she rebuilt the very wall that had stopped mathematicians for centuries. When she finished outlining the old impasse, she paused. The board was nearly full, but a narrow strip of white space remained to the right. That space would decide everything. She lifted the chalk again, preparing not just to extend her solution, but to dismantle the final barrier that history had left standing. Emily stood before the narrow strip of white space as if it were the edge of a cliff. The historical objection loomed behind her in clean, undeniable symbols reconstructed exactly as it had appeared in journals and lectures for generations. Mr. Reed watched without speaking, his earlier authority replaced by something more fragile, a careful restraint. The class did not understand every technical detail, but they understood the stakes. This was the wall that had stopped everyone. Emily lifted the chalk and began slowly, not by attacking the contradiction directly, but by isolating the assumption buried inside it. She circled a single term within the classical argument and rewrote it beneath the original, adjusting its definition to reflect the geometric reframing she had introduced earlier. The difference was subtle, almost invisible, unless someone was looking for it. Mr. Reed leaned closer, his eyes tracking the alteration. Emily explained quietly, her voice steady, that the historical contradiction depended on treating that term as static across all domains, an assumption that held under traditional algebraic framing, but shifted under analytic continuation. She wrote the modified expression step by step, substituting her corrected boundary into the classical structure. The chalk moved carefully, each stroke deliberate, as she dismantled the internal tension that had caused the collapse centuries ago. A few students exchanged confused looks, but no one dared to interrupt. Tyler's mouth hung slightly open as he tried to follow the cascading logic. Mr. Reed reached toward the board again, then stopped himself. He wanted to object, but he could not yet identify a flaw. Emily completed the substitution and simplified the expression, slowly revealing that the contradiction dissolved when the boundary condition was treated dynamically rather than rigidly. The divergence that had appeared inevitable flattened into coherence. The classical dead end no longer ended. It curved back into the structure she had built from the beginning. She stepped back, her heart pounding hard enough that she could hear it in her ears, but her face remained composed. The board now contained both the original historical barrier and the path through it. Mr. Reed read it once, then again. His breathing grew heavier, not from exertion but from recognition. If she was correct, the 200-year impasse had never been absolute. It had been conditional. And she had just rewritten the condition. Mr. Reed did not move for several long seconds. He studied the board as though the symbols might rearrange themselves if he stared hard enough. Emily remained still beside him, her hands lightly dusted with chalk, her shoulders squared but not defiant. She had not spoken beyond what was necessary to explain the structural shift. The logic now stood on its own. The classroom air felt heavy, dense with something no one had anticipated when the lesson began. Mr. Reed stepped forward and traced the classical contradiction again, with his finger following the path that had once guaranteed failure. He paused at the precise point where divergence had historically erupted, and then shifted his gaze to the modification Emily had introduced. The difference was minimal in appearance but profound in consequence. He began testing it silently, reworking the sequence in his head, searching for hidden instability, for circular reasoning, for any breach in rigor. Emily watched him without blinking. She knew this was the moment that mattered most. Not the writing, not the explanation, but the scrutiny. Tyler swallowed hard and glanced around the room as if hoping someone else would challenge her, but no one spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow across the whiteboard now crowded with layered reasoning. Mr. Reed reached for the chalk again and wrote a small auxiliary expression off to the side, constructing a parallel case meant to stress test her dynamic boundary. He simplified it carefully, then extended it further, pushing beyond what she had shown. The room remained completely silent. When he reached the final step of his test case, he stopped. The instability he anticipated did not appear. Instead, the correction absorbed the pressure again, maintaining coherence across the extended domain. He erased the auxiliary case slowly, his movements deliberate. Emily felt her pulse echo in her ears, but kept her expression steady. Mr. Reed turned toward her at last. There was no amusement in his face now. There was no dismissal. There was only calculation giving way to realization. "You are saying," he began slowly, his voice lower than before, "that the contradiction was never inherent to the problem itself, but to the framework used to interpret it." Emily met his eyes and nodded once. The statement hung in the air like a revelation. Around them, 30 students sat frozen, witnessing the shift in authority as it unfolded not through argument, but through proof. The words lingered between them, heavier than any equation on the board. Mr. Reed turned back toward the whiteboard slowly, as if hoping distance would change what he was seeing. He scanned the full progression, from the original reframing to the dynamic boundary, from the analytic continuation to the dismantled contradiction. Each layer connected cleanly. There were no gaps left unaddressed. Emily felt the room pressing inward, not with hostility now, but with expectation. She knew that understanding was spreading through the space even among those who could not articulate the mathematics. The authority in the room had shifted not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Mr. Reed ran a hand through his hair, something he rarely did during lectures. It was a small gesture, but everyone noticed. He stepped back from the board and looked at the class, then at Emily again. "If the framework was the limitation," he said carefully, "then the solution was hidden in plain sight." His voice carried no sarcasm now, only reflection. Emily swallowed and allowed herself to speak one more time, her tone respectful but firm. She explained that sometimes a problem survives for centuries, not because it is unsolvable, but because it is approached with the wrong lens. She spoke about perspective, about the danger of assuming that traditional methods must always define the boundaries of possibility. The class listened in stunned silence. Tyler stared at the board, as if trying to reconcile the girl he had dismissed minutes earlier with the precision of the proof before him. Mr. Reed walked to the far side of the board and reviewed the final line once more. This time not searching for error, but confirming integrity. He nodded almost imperceptibly. The clock ticked above them, marking the passage of time that felt suspended. Outside the window, a school bus pulled away from the curb, its engine fading into the distance. Inside room 214, something irreversible had happened. The problem that had once seemed untouchable now stood resolved in chalk dust and quiet certainty. Mr. Reed faced the class again, but his gaze settled on Emily. He opened his mouth to speak, then paused as if recognizing that whatever came next would not simply be a comment on mathematics. It would be an acknowledgement of something far deeper. Mr. Reed finally spoke, and when he did, his voice did not carry across the room with the effortless authority it once had. It carried weight. "Emily," he said slowly, as if testing the shape of her name in a new context, "walk us through it one more time." It was not a command. It was a request. The shift was subtle, but every student felt it. Emily turned back toward the board, her pulse echoing in her ears, her hands still dusted white. She began again at the top, retracing the entire structure, not skipping a single transformation, not compressing the logic into shortcuts. This time, Mr. Reed did not interrupt. He followed beside her like a student. The class watched as she rebuilt the path step by step, the reframing, the boundary, the extension, the dismantled contradiction. With each explanation, her confidence deepened. She was no longer defending herself. She was teaching. The room that had once expected her embarrassment now depended on her clarity. When she reached the final resolution again, she did not rush through it. She paused and let the silence settle around the proof. "The contradiction only exists if the framework stays rigid," she said evenly. "If the structure is allowed to evolve with the boundary, the instability disappears." Her voice did not tremble. Mr. Reed looked at the board for a long moment, then at the class. "She is correct," he said quietly. The words did not explode. They landed, heavy, irreversible. A ripple moved through the room, not laughter, not applause, but stunned recognition. Tyler lowered his eyes to his desk. A few students stared at Emily as if seeing her for the first time. Mr. Reed stepped forward again, facing the board, and placed his hand flat against the chalk tray, as though steadying himself. For over 2 centuries, he continued, his tone measured. This problem has been constrained by tradition. Today it was re-examined. He turned toward her fully, and resolved. The final word hung in the air like a bell that had been struck only once. Emily felt something shift inside her, not pride exactly, but validation. The quiet girl from the 3rd row was no longer invisible. The room that had once narrowed around her now expanded. The authority that had defined the space had changed hands without argument, without confrontation, simply through proof. And in the silence that followed, no one laughed. The silence did not break into applause. It deepened. 30 students sat motionless, staring at the whiteboard filled edge to edge with proof that had just rewritten something older than any building in Columbus. Emily could feel their eyes on her, but for the first time, the weight of those stares did not press her down. It lifted her. Mr. Reed walked slowly toward his desk, then stopped halfway, as if the distance suddenly felt symbolic. He turned back toward the board, studying it again almost reverently. "Do you understand what you have done?" he asked, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it during class. Emily hesitated. She understood the mathematics. She understood the structure. But what she had done inside this room was larger than symbols. "I solved it," she said carefully. Mr. Reed nodded once. "You challenged the assumption that defined it," he corrected gently. The distinction hung in the air. Around them, the classroom felt different, as though the walls had shifted outward by a few inches. Tyler finally spoke, his voice unsteady. That problem was supposed to be impossible. It was not an accusation. It was disbelief. Emily looked at him not with triumph, but with calm clarity. "It was supposed to be unsolved," she replied. "That is not the same thing." A few students exchanged glances, absorbing the difference. Mr. Reed stepped forward again, closer to her, now no trace of condescension left in his posture. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked. The question was not rhetorical. Emily thought of the public library 3 miles from school, the wooden tables worn smooth by decades of hands, the stack of donated journals she had checked out so many times the librarian no longer needed to see her card. She thought of nights spent rewriting proofs while her mother's car headlights flashed through the apartment window after a late shift. "I read," she answered simply. Mr. Reed studied her for a long moment, then faced the class. "There is a difference between memorizing methods and understanding structure," he said. "Today, you witnessed structure." His voice carried across the room without force. It did not need it. Emily stood beside the board, the chalk dust still clinging to her fingertips, and for the first time in her life inside Jefferson High, no one saw her as the quiet girl in the gray sweater. They saw the mind that had just shifted the room itself, and in that stillness, the hierarchy that once felt permanent quietly dissolved. Mr. Reed walked back to the front of the room and stood beside Emily, not towering over her, not reclaiming the space, but sharing it. The whiteboard behind them held the full argument, layered and complete, the kind of work most students would only ever see summarized in textbooks. He looked at the class, slowly making eye contact with faces that had laughed less than an hour earlier. "I told her she could not solve it," he said plainly. There was no defensiveness in his voice, only acknowledgement. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tyler stared at his desk, tracing the edge of his notebook with his finger. Mr. Reed continued, "I was wrong." The words landed harder than any correction he had ever given on a graded exam. Emily felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment, but from the sudden weight of being recognized publicly. The authority in the room had not just shifted, it had humbled itself. Mr. Reed turned toward her again. "You did not just find an answer," he said. "You reframed the question." He paused, letting that distinction settle over the class. That is what real mathematics is. The clock above the board ticked softly, marking the end of a period that no one would forget. Emily looked out at her classmates, meeting their eyes one by one. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, only quiet steadiness. She had not stood up to prove them wrong. She had stood up because the structure made sense in her mind, and she could not ignore it. Mr. Reed faced the class once more. "Let this be a reminder." He said, his voice firm but measured, that talent does not announce itself with volume. It reveals itself through discipline. The words echoed through the room. A student in the back slowly began to clap, once, then stopped, unsure. The sound was not necessary. The silence said more. Emily stepped away from the board, returning the chalk to the tray, as if placing something sacred back where it belonged. As she walked toward her seat, the path between the desks felt different than it had earlier that morning. No one laughed. No one whispered. The gray sweater, the worn backpack, the quiet presence in the third row no longer defined her. What defined her now was written across the whiteboard in steady, deliberate lines. And as she sat down, she understood something deeper than victory. She understood that being underestimated had never been her weakness. It had been her advantage. The bell rang, but no one moved right away. The sharp electric buzz that usually triggered a rush for the door felt almost out of place against the stillness in room 214. Students gathered their books more slowly than usual, stealing glances at the whiteboard, as if afraid the proof might vanish if they looked away for too long. Emily remained seated for a moment, her notebook closed in front of her, her fingers resting lightly on its worn cover. The room no longer felt like a stage where she had been tested. It felt like a place that had shifted under its own weight. Mr. Reed cleared his throat gently. "Emily, could you stay for a moment?" His tone carried none of the authority it once had. It carried respect. Tyler hesitated near the aisle, then glanced back at her. For the first time, there was no smirk, only uncertainty and perhaps something close to admiration. One by one, the students filed out into the hallway, their voices low and thoughtful instead of loud and careless. When the door finally closed, the classroom grew quiet again, but this silence felt different. It was not tense. It was reflective. Mr. Reed walked to the board and studied the equations once more, as though committing them to memory. "I owe you an apology," he said, turning toward her fully. "Not for challenging you. That is my job. But for assuming you could not rise to it." Emily looked at him steadily. "You did not know," she replied. He nodded slowly. "That is precisely the point." He walked back to his desk and picked up a small stack of papers, then set them down again, distracted by thought. "Have you ever considered submitting work like this beyond high school?" he asked. The question hung in the air with new possibility. Emily hesitated. College had always felt like a distant outline, something shaped by tuition numbers and scholarship forms rather than ambition. "I have considered it," she answered quietly. Mr. Reed stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "There are professors at Ohio State University who would want to see this," he said carefully. "Real mathematicians." The word felt larger than the classroom itself. Emily felt a quiet surge in her chest, not of pride but of direction. The proof on the board was no longer just a moment of reversal. It was a doorway. And for the first time, the path beyond Jefferson High did not look abstract. It looked reachable. Emily walked home that afternoon beneath a pale Ohio sky, her backpack resting against her shoulders, the late-day sun stretching long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, small houses lined close together, chain-link fences, the distant hum of traffic from the main road a quarter mile away. Nothing around her suggested that anything extraordinary had happened. Yet inside her, something had shifted permanently. She replayed Mr. Reed's words in her mind, the mention of professors of mathematicians of doors that could open beyond the limits she had quietly accepted. When she reached her apartment building, she climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, the scent of laundry detergent drifting from somewhere down the hall. Her mother's car was not yet in the parking lot, which meant she had at least an hour before the evening routine began. Emily set her backpack on the small kitchen table and opened her notebook again, flipping to the pages where she had first sketched the geometric reframing weeks earlier. The paper was filled with crossed-out attempts, arrows margins packed with notes written in careful pencil. She traced the original idea with her finger, remembering the night she had almost abandoned it, convinced it was too bold, too different from what textbooks suggested. A faint smile touched her lips. Different had been the key. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock above the sink. She walked to the small window overlooking the parking lot and looked out at the fading light. College had always been discussed in terms of money, in terms of scholarships that felt competitive and uncertain. Now it felt like something tied to purpose. She imagined stepping into a lecture hall at Ohio State University, sitting among students who loved structure the way she did, who saw equations not as obstacles, but as landscapes to explore. The thought did not intimidate her. It steadied her. She returned to the table and began rewriting the full proof cleanly line by line, as if preparing it for someone else's eyes. This was no longer just an answer to a classroom challenge. It was evidence of who she was becoming, and as the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the worn kitchen floor, Emily understood that the quiet hours in the public library had never been small. They had been preparation. The next morning, Emily returned to Jefferson High carrying more than just her backpack. She carried a cleanly rewritten proof pages, carefully organized and clipped together, each line precise and deliberate. The hallway buzzed with the usual morning noise, lockers, slamming sneakers, squeaking against polished tile, conversations about weekend plans and upcoming games. Yet as she walked toward room 214, something subtle followed her. A glance here, a nod there, not exaggerated, not theatrical, just different. When she entered the classroom, Tyler was already seated. He looked up, hesitated, then gave a small, respectful nod before returning to his notebook. No jokes, no whispers. The gray sweater she wore looked the same as it always had, but it no longer defined her place in the room. When Mr. Reed stepped inside. A few minutes later, he carried himself with a quiet deliberation. He greeted the class, then paused as his eyes met Emily's. There was no spectacle in his acknowledgement, only a steady recognition. "Before we begin," he said evenly, "I would like to follow up on yesterday." The room settled instantly. He gestured toward the front, not as a challenge this time, but as an invitation. Emily stood and walked forward again, not with hesitation, but with calm assurance. She handed him the clipped pages. He reviewed the first sheet briefly, then looked up at the class. This, he said carefully, is what intellectual courage looks like. The phrase hung in the air. He explained that he had contacted a colleague at Ohio State University the previous evening, forwarding a scanned copy of her argument. A response had already come back. Interest, genuine interest, a request to discuss the framework further. A quiet wave of astonishment moved through the room. Emily felt her heart pound, but her posture remained steady. This was no longer about proving someone wrong. It was about stepping into a future she had once considered distant. Mr. Reed returned the pages to her, with both hands a gesture of respect. "Opportunity does not always arrive loudly," he said. "Sometimes it waits for someone willing to see differently." Emily returned to her seat, the clipped proof resting on her desk. Around her, the classroom felt transformed. Not because the walls had changed, but because perspective had. And in that shift, The quiet girl from the third row was no longer underestimated. She was anticipated. By the end of the week, the story had traveled beyond room 214. It moved through the hallways in quiet conversations, through the teacher's lounge in measured tones, through email threads that carried scanned pages and careful commentary. Emily did not chase the attention. She moved through her days the same way she always had, arriving early, sitting in the third row, opening her notebook before the bell rang. But something fundamental had shifted. When classmates spoke to her now, their voices carried curiosity instead of condescension. Questions replaced assumptions. Even Tyler approached her after class one afternoon, asking her to explain how she recognized the hidden symmetry so quickly. She did not boast. She simply described the long hours at the public library, the trial and error, the willingness to look where others had stopped. At home, her mother listened quietly as Emily described the email from Ohio State University, her eyes shining with a mixture of disbelief and pride. The small kitchen felt warmer that night, as if the future had stepped inside with them. Emily returned to her notebook once more, not to relive the moment of triumph, but to continue exploring the structure that had captivated her. The problem that once defined the week no longer defined her. It had become a beginning rather than a peak. And as she sat by the window, the streetlight casting a soft glow across the pages, she understood something simple and steady. The silence that once surrounded her in that classroom had not been emptiness. It had been space. Space waiting to be filled by someone who dared to see differently. Weeks later, the whiteboard in room 214 had been erased and filled many times over with new lessons, new equations, new challenges. Yet the memory of that afternoon remained suspended in the space like a quiet imprint. Mr. Reed taught differently now. He paused longer before dismissing unconventional approaches. He asked more questions instead of delivering immediate conclusions. The class responded in kind, less eager to laugh, more willing to think. Emily noticed the shift without drawing attention to it. She continued solving problems, continued visiting the public library 3 miles from home, continued rewriting ideas in careful pencil late into the evening. But she also began exchanging emails with a professor from Ohio State University who asked thoughtful questions about her framework and encouraged her to expand it further. The conversations were rigorous, challenging, and deeply affirming. At school, students who once overlooked her now asked for her perspective during group assignments. She did not dominate discussions. She contributed with calm precision, the same steadiness she had shown at the board. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the classroom windows and dust particles drifted in slow motion through the air, Mr. Reed glanced toward the third row and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was the recognition of a teacher who had witnessed transformation not only in a student, but in himself. Emily looked down at her notebook, filled with fresh calculations and new questions, and felt no need to prove anything anymore. The laughter that once echoed in the room had been replaced by something quieter and stronger: respect. And in that steady rhythm of learning and growth, the moment that began as doubt had become a foundation for everything that followed. On a quiet spring afternoon, Emily stood outside Jefferson High and looked back at the brick building that had once felt so confining. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and a warm breeze moved gently through the trees lining the parking lot. In her backpack rested a letter embossed with the seal of Ohio State University, offering her a scholarship to study mathematics in the fall. She had read it 3 times the night before, tracing each word slowly, letting the reality settle into her bones. Her mother had cried softly at the kitchen table, not out of surprise, but out of recognition of every late shift, every sacrifice, every quiet evening that had built toward this moment. Across the lot, Mr. Reed stepped out of the building and caught sight of her. He raised a hand in greeting, not as a superior, but as someone who had witnessed the unfolding of potential. Emily returned the gesture with a small smile. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand celebrations, just the steady understanding that something significant had taken root in that classroom months earlier. The problem that once defined her doubt had become the foundation of her future. She adjusted the straps of her backpack and turned toward the sidewalk, the path ahead, stretching forward under clear Ohio sky. She knew the road would not always be easy. Higher mathematics would challenge her in new ways, but she also knew something unshakable now. Being underestimated had never limited her. It had sharpened her. As she walked away from the school, the building growing smaller behind her, she carried more than acceptance letters and proof pages. She carried certainty. And sometimes certainty is louder than any laughter that ever tried to silence it. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.